was the last Sunday of October 1977, one of those northeastern Indiana afternoons when the light comes off the soybean fields at a low angle and turns everything briefly gold before the early dark sets in and the temperature drops 20 degrees in an hour. In the town of Roanoke, Indiana, population 1,100, Huntington County, a place where the grain elevator and the water tower were the two tallest things for miles in any direction. The Sunday afternoon service at First Lutheran had just let out. Families were crossing the parking lot to their cars in the particular unhurried way of people who have nowhere urgent to be and nowhere they would rather be than here. Children were running. Someone had brought a casserole dish in a quilted carrier. The smell of leaf smoke from across the highway drifted through the cool air. 19-year-old Vera Hutchins had been at that service. Her mother had seen her. Her older brother Walt had driven her. She had sat in the third pew from the front on the left side, which was where the Hutchins family always sat. And she had sung the closing hymn in the clear, unhurried way that her choir director had been trying for 2 years to get her to do for solos. She had waved to the Kessler family on her way out. She had said something to the pastor, a few words, something about Thanksgiving coming. And she had walked across the parking lot in her good coat and her brown shoes and had told Walt she would see him at dinner. She was walking to a friend's house 3 blocks away. She never arrived. She never came to dinner. She was never, in 46 years of searching, officially found. But to understand what was finally spoken aloud in that same church 46 years later, what a man stood up and said at a Sunday morning service in October 2023, in front of his congregation and his pastor and the people who had known him all his life. You have to understand what Vera Hutchins meant to Roanoke, Indiana. You have to understand the specific weight of a small town that carries a missing girl for nearly half a century and never puts the grief entirely down. Roanoke in 1977 was a farming community in the truest sense. The rhythms of the year were organized around planting and harvest. The school year bent to accommodate the fall work, and the social architecture of the town was the church, the grain cooperative, the Legion Hall, and the diner on Main Street that had been there since 1949 and had the same pie case it had always had. It was the kind of town where you did not need to introduce yourself at the hardware store because they already knew your family's account and what you drove, and where the news traveled without newspapers because everyone was 3 conversations away from everyone else. The Hutchins family had farmed 40 acres east of town for 40 years. Vera's father, Harold, was a quiet, deliberate man who wore the same style of canvas jacket from September to April, and who had the particular quality of stillness that farmers sometimes develop. The ability to wait and watch and not force things. Her mother, Louise, was the president of the church women's auxiliary and made the best apple butter in Huntington County, according to anyone who had been asked. Vera had 2 brothers, Walt, who was 23 in 1977, and Dale, who was 16. Vera herself was 19 and had finished high school the previous spring. She was working at the grain cooperative part-time and saving money with a specific purpose. She wanted to go to Fort Wayne and study practical nursing. She had the application on her desk at home. She had talked to the admissions office by telephone in September. She had told her mother in October that she was going to send the application in November, after harvest was over and there was more time to do it right. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall and had her mother's brown hair and a laugh that carried, which people in Roanoke mentioned when they described her more often than almost anything else. She had been going to First Lutheran her entire life. She had been in the Sunday school, the youth group, the junior choir, and now the adult choir. And every person in that congregation had watched her grow from a small child singing too loudly in the front row to a young woman who sang with the particular precision of someone who has finally understood what her voice can do. On the Sunday before she disappeared, She had told the choir director, a man named Henry Schaefer, that she thought she was finally ready to do the solo at the Advent service in December. He had told her she had been ready for 2 years. She had laughed, that carrying laugh, and said she'd believe it when she heard herself do it. She never sang the solo. She never sent the application. She never came to dinner on that last Sunday of October 1977. And by the time the Huntington County Sheriff's Department had been called and the search had gone out through the flat farmland between Roanoke and the neighboring communities, there was nothing to find and nothing found. And the October light was already gone. Walt Hutchins noticed she was missing at 5:45 p.m. when she had not come back for dinner and was not answering at her friend's house. He drove the 3 blocks himself and confirmed she had never arrived. He was back at the family house at 6:00 p.m. His mother called the sheriff's department at 6:07 p.m. A deputy arrived at 6:38 p.m. and took a description. By 7:30, word had spread through the telephone tree that connected Roanoke's households, the party line system that still served parts of Huntington County in 1977. And by 8:00 p.m., 16 men were in vehicles driving the roads between the church and the friend's house and the surrounding countryside, with headlights and flashlights and the particular grim focus of a farming community that knows how to organize itself when something needs to be done. Nothing was found that night. By the following morning, the search had expanded. By noon, the Indiana State Police had been notified. By the end of the week, over 200 volunteers had walked every field and ditch and woodlot within 4 miles of Roanoke. The church organized food for the searchers. Louise Hutchins stood in the church kitchen and made sandwiches alongside women she had known her entire life, because there was nothing else to do with her hands. What investigators had. Vera had been seen leaving the church parking lot alone at approximately 2:45 p.m. A woman named Harriet Voss, who had been walking her dog on Church Street, had seen a young woman matching Vera's description walking south on Church Street at approximately 2:50 p.m., moving at a normal pace. No one had seen her after that. Church Street ran for 2 blocks before it intersected with Maple, where her friend lived. She had been seen covering the first block. She had not been seen on the second. What was noted quietly in the first investigation and never adequately pursued: the house on the southeast corner of Church and Maple. A 2-story farmhouse that had been owned since 1971 by a man named Reuben Gant had a truck in the driveway that afternoon that had not been there in the morning. Gant was 34 years old in 1977. He had lived in Roanoke since childhood and was known as a regular, if quiet, presence at First Lutheran. He worked at the grain cooperative alongside Vera's part-time position. He was interviewed once, 2 weeks after Vera's disappearance, by a deputy who noted his account as consistent and unremarkable. The truck in the driveway on the afternoon of October 30th was mentioned in the interview and not followed up on. It was an oversight that would hold for 45 years. The investigator assigned to the Vera Hutchins case in November 1977, 3 weeks after she disappeared, was a Huntington County detective named Gordon Staley, who was 45 years old and who had grown up in Huntington County himself, which meant he knew every family in the case and felt the weight of that personally in a way that outside investigators do not. He was thorough, methodical, and deeply troubled by a case that produced no evidence and no body and no direction. Staley pursued Vera's disappearance for 4 years before the case was functionally set aside. He developed 2 persons of interest. The first was a young man named Terry Funk, 22 years old in 1977, who had a prior arrest for disorderly conduct, who had attended a gathering at the Legion Hall on the afternoon of October 30th, and who had been unable to account for a 2-hour gap in his afternoon. Funk was interviewed 3 times between 1977 and 1979. His accounts shifted between interviews in ways Staley noted carefully. He was never charged. He moved to Fort Wayne in 1980. He died in an automobile accident in 1985. The second was a man whose name Staley wrote in his notebook with 2 question marks beside it. Reuben Gant. Gant had been cooperative, unremarkable, and apparently above suspicion. He attended church faithfully. He served on the Grain Cooperative Board. He organized the church's spring cleanup every April, when volunteers raked the churchyard and righted headstones that had settled over winter. He was, in the language of the community that knew him, a reliable and decent man. Nobody had anything specific against him. Nobody had anything specific at all. But Staley had sat across from him in an interview room in November 1977, and something had sat wrong. He could not say what. He noted 2 question marks. Wrong somehow. Nothing to prove it. He died in 1998 without being able to name what was wrong. His notebooks went to his daughter, who kept them in a box in her attic in Huntington. Louise Hutchins lived to be 83. She died in 2019, 42 years after her daughter disappeared, without an answer. Harold had died in 1994. Walt still lived in Roanoke, had never left, had farmed the family land for 40 years, had never stopped being the brother who drove her to church that last Sunday morning. Dale had moved to Indianapolis, but came back for the church anniversary services every year because it was the last place anyone had seen Vera. And some people need to keep going back to the last place. By 1990, 13 years had passed. The grain cooperative where Vera had worked had been rebuilt on a new site south of town. The friend she had been walking to see had moved to Columbus, Indiana, and then to Cincinnati, and kept a photograph of Vera on her dresser. By 2005, 28 years. Reuben Gant was 62 years old. He still lived in the farmhouse on the southeast corner of Church and Maple. He still attended First Lutheran. He still organized the spring cleanup. He still righted headstones in the churchyard every April. The headstone closest to the southeast corner of the churchyard, the one that had a tendency to settle and lean each winter more than the others, the one that Reuben Gant straightened every single spring without being asked, the one he had been straightening every April for 46 years, was not a grave that the church records accounted for. Nobody had noticed. Nobody had thought to look. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that deserved better. If you believe that kind of work matters, take a second to like and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We read every one of them. Now let's get back to Vera. The break came from a direction nobody anticipated, which is the way breaks in cases like this one almost always come, not from a new technology or a new investigator, but from inside the man who had been carrying the truth for 46 years and had arrived, finally, at the point where carrying it was no longer possible. On the 3rd Sunday of October 2023, the Sunday closest to the anniversary of Vera's disappearance, which fell on October 30th, Reuben Gant stood up in the middle of the morning service at First Lutheran Church in Roanoke, Indiana. He was 80 years old. He had been in the congregation for 67 of those years. He stood up during the silent prayer time, which First Lutheran observed for 3 minutes before the offertory. And he said, into the silence, to the people who had known him his entire life, that he needed to confess something that had been wrong for a long time. The pastor, a 42-year-old woman named Reverend Kathy Wolf, who had been at First Lutheran for 6 years, said later that she did not immediately understand what was happening. She thought it was a doctrinal confession, the kind that occasionally emerged from an older congregant at a reflective moment. She let him speak. He spoke for 11 minutes. He told them where Vera Hutchins was. The details of what Reuben Gant said during those 11 minutes were recorded by 3 congregation members on their phones, confirmed by the church's audio system, and turned over to the Huntington County Sheriff's Department that same afternoon. He confessed to having encountered Vera on Church Street on the afternoon of October 30th, 1977, and to a confrontation that ended with Vera's death. A confrontation that began, he said, as an argument over something he could no longer clearly remember, and which in the telling sounded as arbitrary as such things always do, which is to say, completely arbitrary, which is to say, without proportion to what followed. He said he had been living with it for 46 years. He said there had not been a single April when he straightened that headstone that he had not thought about stopping, and he had not stopped, and he didn't know what that said about him. What it said about him, the congregation of First Lutheran was left to work out for itself in the weeks that followed. They are still working on it. Gant was taken into custody by the Huntington County Sheriff's Department on the afternoon of October 22nd, 2023. He was 80 years old, ambulatory, and medically evaluated as competent to stand trial. A search of the churchyard began within 48 hours. Ground-penetrating radar was used to locate the anomaly beneath the settled ground near the southeast corner. Excavation confirmed human remains on October 28, 2023, 2 days before the 46th anniversary of Vera Hutchins' disappearance. Dental records identified her. The identification was confirmed on November 3, 2023. Walt Hutchins, 70 years old, was called that morning by the Huntington County Investigator's Office. He drove to his sister's grave before he called his brother. He stood in the churchyard, which was familiar to him in the way that the churchyards of a lifetime are familiar. And he looked at the ground that had held her for 46 years, in a place where people had been walking and praying and singing and writing headstones. And he did not, by any account that has been given, know what to say. He called Dale. Dale drove up from Indianapolis that afternoon. Reuben Gant was charged with murder in the first degree in November 2023. He was 80 years old. His attorney filed for a competency hearing and a medical deferral, citing Gant's age and declining physical health. Both motions were denied. He pleaded guilty in March 2024. He was sentenced in May 2024 to 30 years, the maximum the court was empowered to impose under sentencing guidelines for a defendant of his age and medical status, combined with the circumstances of the offense. He will not serve 30 years. The court was direct about this. The community of Roanoke, Indiana, which had known Reuben Gant for the entire 80 years of his life, absorbed this in the way that small communities absorb the most difficult revelations about the people they trusted. Slowly, in pieces, with a mixture of grief and rage, and the particular disorientation of looking back across a lifetime at a man who had organized the spring cleanup and straightened the headstones and sat in the pew and sung the hymns and done all the ordinary things that ordinary men do. And understanding that the ordinary things had been the camouflage, not the character. The pastor, Reverend Wolf, held an additional service the following Sunday. It was not about Reuben Gant. It was about Vera Hutchins. She asked the congregation to speak her name, and they did, out loud, together, in the church where Vera had sung and where she had talked to the pastor about Thanksgiving and where she had been working toward a solo she never got to sing. They spoke her name. It filled the room. Vera Hutchins was buried on November 16, 2023, in the Roanoke Community Cemetery, 400 yards from the churchyard where she had spent 46 years. The service was held at First Lutheran. The choir sang. Walt and Dale sat in the third pew from the front on the left side, which was where the Hutchins family had always sat. The application for practical nursing school, the one Vera had filled out in the fall of 1977 and planned to send after harvest, had been kept by her mother Louise. Walt found it in a box in the farmhouse after Louise died in 2019. He kept it. He brought it to the service. Gordon Staley's daughter, Linda Staley Mercer, attended the burial. She had brought her father's notebooks to the sheriff's department when the case reopened. She had read the entry. 2 question marks. Wrong, somehow. Nothing to prove it. She had called the department herself when she heard that Gant had confessed. She stood near the back of the cemetery and thought about a man who had spent his career on this case and had felt the wrongness in the room, and had not been wrong, and had simply not been able to prove it, and had been right for 25 years before he died, and right for 25 more years afterward. Some things that are right do not become true until the person who is right is gone. That is one of the ways that time is cruel to the people who deserve better from it. The Churchyard headstone that Gant had been straightening every April for 46 years was removed in November 2023. The ground beneath it was restored. A small memorial marker was placed in the church garden, with Vera's name and dates and one line chosen by her brothers. She was going to sing the solo. It is not a full accounting of who Vera Hutchins was. No single line could be. But it contains the specific, precise, irreplaceable thing that was taken. The future she was already building. The voice she was finally ready to use. The December that never came. There are confessions that come from conscience, and confessions that come from exhaustion, and confessions that come because a person has lived so long inside a secret that the secret has become heavier than the person can carry. Reuben Gant's 11 minutes in First Lutheran Church was the third kind. He had straightened her headstone for 46 springs, and he had done it deliberately, not as cruelty, not as a ritual of mourning, but as a form of private maintenance of the one thing he could not let go of. And in the end, the thing he could not let go of was the thing that held him in place long enough for justice to find him. He had been in that churchyard every April. He had never left. The confession was, in a way, already there, announced every spring in a pair of hands straightening a stone above a grave that didn't belong in that yard, that no one in the congregation had ever been asked to account for, until one Sunday in October, when an 80-year-old man finally said the words out loud, and the silence that had lasted 46 years was over. Justice found Vera Hutchins after 46 years. It found her in the churchyard she had walked past every Sunday of her life, spoken by a man who could not carry it one more season. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved stories are in the description below. Thank you for watching.